Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I am thrilled to welcome back Impex Beverages as the Whiskey Ring Podcast presenting sponsor. Each month, we'll be talking about a new set of single casks, maybe feature a chosen distillery, or single cask from a chosen distillery. Listen for the mid-roll for more info on this month's offerings. And now, a brand new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we think we're in episode 77, if I'm counting correct, which is insane. Never thought you'd get this high. But today we are going back over to Western Pennsylvania, and I'm thrilled to welcome, Jim Hough from Liberty Pole Spirits, and also known as Mingo Creek Distillers, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Jim, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to be here. It's an honor. Appreciate it.
I'm so happy to have you on. So, yeah, let's jump right in with the Liberty Pole versus Mingo Creek. Which is which, and where should we divide it up?
So think of Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch. It's kind of the best way to really think about what we've got going on here. Mingo Creek Craft Distillers, we always had an image and a thought of honoring the history of the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. And when we incorporated, we actually formed our LLC in January of 2015, which was about 17 months before we opened our doors. And at that point, we had yet to really learn or discover what Liberty Poles were. But we knew the Mingo Creek Society was the name of the kind of the most, the farmer distillers of Western Pennsylvania who were the most against the Whiskey Rebellion or the whiskey tax. So we formed our LLC as the Mingo Creek Craft Distillers, honoring the Mingo Creek Society. As we got closer to opening, we did more research and we found, this notion of a Liberty Pole, which was just to us really fitting. It was the symbol of opposition to that excise tax. It's a symbol that goes back to ancient Greek times, but it was very popular during colonial America. And we just thought that resonated. That was easier to remember. It just had a better, kind of a brand pop to us. So we decided to create a brand under Mingo Creek Craft Distillers, and our brand is Liberty Pole. So really, it's corporate entity Mingo Creek Craft Distillers. Those guys that they pay the taxes, which is ironic given our honoring of the Whiskey Rebellion guys. And Liberty Pole is our brand, and that's what we want to be known as. And it's just kind of a circumstances that Mingo Creek Craft Distillers is so out there these days. Hindsight's 2020. We wish we would have thought of Liberty Poles when we incorporated the name, but
if you got it all right at the beginning, there wouldn't be much to be interesting over the years, right?
Exactly.
And I was mentioning, but just before we started, one of the episodes that I listened to in preparation for this was you did a great episode with Alan Bishop and Christy Atkinson on Distillers Talk in November. And when you were getting into the colonial history, one of the things you pointed out was kind of everything related to the Whiskey Rebellion. It seems like, especially in Pennsylvania, is trademarked already.
Yes.
Yeah. And, I'm also curious just kind of where you came about the Liberty Pole thing, because the idea of the word of liberty in its own entity, you've got at the other half of the state, you've got New Liberty Distillers over there, you've got a couple of brewers, of course, using the term liberty. It's kind of all over
Right.
The identity of Pennsylvania almost. But Liberty Poles and of course the Whiskey Rebellion is more where you guys are in Washington, Pennsylvania.
Right.
So how do you kind of come across that in the histories?
You know what, David? We were consumed with books about the Whiskey Rebellion, and Liberty Poles just kept popping up. Every every book that we would read would talk about the erection of liberty poles to protest the tax. And one of the seminal events in the Whiskey Rebellion was the raising of a liberty pole in Washington, Pennsylvania, which back then was known as Bassitt Town. But there were 400 people that showed up in what's now Washington to erect this liberty pole, and that was one of the final kind of straws that that President Washington and Alexander Hamilton were really monitoring, that this situation in Western Pennsylvania was kind of spiraling out of control. And just the more we read about liberty poles, just the more in love we fell with that concept. And we have a colonial woman carrying a liberty pole on our label, and it's always been a part of our label, and it always will. And it's kind of it really fits our story, and we like to say that that the liberty pole is proudly displayed on every bottle of spirits that leaves our distillery.
I mean, it certainly it catches the eye for sure, which I can definitely appreciate. So the Whiskey Rebellion in general, I'll admit to being behind on my own reading on that. You can thank Professor Schrod, who just recorded a couple of weeks ago his history of Prohibition, which took quite a bit of my time. Very worth it, but that took up some of my reading time. But with the Whiskey Rebellion, what I wanted to kind of talk to you about and ask you about was, there's something about how it happened in Western Pennsylvania. Like, just to put it bluntly, that of course Western Pennsylvania was not the only place that people were pissed off about this whiskey tax. I'm sure the distillers in New York, New Jersey, from DC, all of this were pissed off as well. And yet the rebellion itself, as we know it, really happened around where you guys are.
Right.
And what do you think led to it happening there as opposed to anywhere else?
We think it's actually pretty simple, in the sense that Pittsburgh kind of had one of the only efforts to collect that tax on the Western frontier. John Neville, General Neville, was a Pittsburgh resident. He was a friend of President Washington's. They served together in the military, and Neville was the tax collector in Pittsburgh, and he was actively trying to collect that excise tax. He was, going out with federal marshals and serving writs of arrest. And the other places on the Western frontier didn't really have that level of the law trying to collect those taxes as Pittsburgh did. And the thing about General Neville that is really ironic is that besides being a personal having a personal relationship with President Washington, he was also a distiller, and he was a big distiller, and he was a very wealthy distiller. Back in those days, the army, the militia, was paid with rations of whiskey. And I'll give you two guesses who had the contract to supply the army with whiskey. It was General Neville. And so just the fact that this very wealthy individual, a landowner, distiller, was trying to collect taxes off of really dirt poor farmers who were only distilling to preserve what little grain they had left over after they fed themselves, and they traded that grain for whatever else they could trade it for. They made whiskey because once you turn that grain into whiskey, it lasts forever. Grain will mold, grain will go bad, but if you turn it into whiskey, so these folks weren't, they weren't distilling as a business. They weren't distilling to get hammered. They were distilling to preserve the effort that they put into their farming, and it was a form of currency on the frontier. There were no banks, there were no roads, there were very very few, if any, government services here in Western Pennsylvania. And whiskey, whiskey was a currency. Whiskey was bartered for goods and services. And so, it was a really unfair tax. And these folks, they were mainly Scots Irish, and I'm Scots Irish myself, and we're very stubborn people, and they most of them had fought in the Revolutionary War, and fought for independence, and it just didn't sit well with them that they were being taxed. It was why we fought for independence. We wanted to escape that taxation without representation, and the farmers here had no protection. They had no protection from the Native Americans. They had no roads. They had no banks. They had no government services. So, I can kind of see their point and why they rebelled. And I think that Western Pennsylvania is so associated with that part of history because, we actually had a tax collector trying to, get that tax money.
And as you point out, at that point in American history, that was the frontier, the Ohio River, Kentucky's just becoming a state carved out of Virginia. So this is really at that point what we think of as the Wild West. It's a lot closer. And I think it's worth doubling up too what you said, that it wasn't commercial distilling. We're not talking even the volumes of Elijah Craig, or because that would have been a couple years later, or anything like that. It was really, you're preserving the grain so you don't lose out on what you've done.
Yep.
And trying to enforce a monetary value on a barter system, which doesn't work today. It didn't work then, clearly.
Right.
So, but it has fascinated me. I want to read more about it and just understand more about the time period. Because I think we tend to think of the Whiskey Rebellion. It's of course the first, and I think the only time federal troops are sent against their own citizens. It's this first tax, then it's repealed a couple of years later. We don't have another one till the Civil War. So,
right.
But it's really an important history lesson.
It is. It's the first time that a presidential pardon was ever used. There were two rebels that were charged with treason and sentenced to hang, and they were eventually pardoned by President Washington. It's really the reason that the National Road was built, right? If you were charged with a federal crime, you had to march back to Philadelphia, which was the capital. And if you were a farmer and you had to leave your family for the 5-month trip to face federal charges, the National Road made that a little bit more easy. But also the establishment of the circuit court system was a direct result of the Whiskey Rebellion. The hardships that people faced back then to face federal charges, it resulted in that whole circuit court system being set up.
And something I just thought of is that the more I talk to people like you, distillers and distilleries with historical roots, here and elsewhere, but especially here in the US, parts of American history that particularly have to do with alcohol, like the Whiskey Rebellion, like excise taxes, even prohibition to a great extent, we don't really learn about that in school.
No.
And for some reason it just clicked that it's probably because it's talking about whiskey in school and it's not really the focus. And maybe that's just conjecture, but it's going to be my conjecture. But it's so, again, the more I talk to historically related distilleries, the more I find it's important to American history, this idea of distillation, the drinking culture that comes along with it, paying the army in rations of first rum and then whiskey. It's an integral part of our history that we really need to teach because it informs so much else.
Yep. Agreed.
Anyway, that's my soapbox on that. So jumping back to Liberty Pole in particular, I have a couple of technical questions, of course, you know me. But I wanted to first start with going back to your relationship with Bill Owens, and talking a little bit more about his influence on how the distillery came to be and you starting in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had a 10-gallon backyard hobby still that I think I got back in the early 2000s, maybe 2005 or 2006. And I really loved the art of distilling, and I had no background. I don't have a moonshining uncle or anything like that. It's just, I had a real interest in it, and just kind of was looking to learn as much as I could. And the more I got into it, the more I started thinking about legal, craft distilling. Craft distilling in 2006-7 was really very in its infancy. And I had stumbled upon the American Distilling Institute. And so I think right around that time, I reached out to Bill and just said, hey, I'm thinking about this. I've been a hobby distiller for a couple of years now. I really enjoy the craft. Do you have any advice? And he said, oh, you're in Washington, Pennsylvania. If you do anything other than whiskey, you shouldn't. I mean, you have to do whiskey. You're in Washington, Pennsylvania. You have to do whiskey. And that really was a light bulb, because that was what I was making anyways. But I think a lot of craft distillers do start off with a spectrum of products, and I think that was my inclination, that you've got to keep the lights on with vodka or gins or things like that. But Bill really hit home when he told us that we should really do whiskey. And we kind of never forgot that. And even though we really didn't start the business for another 7 or 8 years after that, I never forgot his advice. And when we put up the business plan together, we decided to make that, and it was a difficult choice, to just focus on whiskey, and that's all we do. But that was great advice, from Bill, and I appreciate it. And I tell him that every time I see him at a conference. We have his picture hanging in our distillery. He came to visit us when we were kind of doing the build out. And Bill, I don't know, David, if you're a Pittsburgh Steeler fan, but the Steelers were owned for many years and they still are owned by the Rooney family. But Art Rooney Sr. Is a legendary character here in Pittsburgh, and Bill Owens has an uncanny resemblance to Art Rooney. And this picture that we have hanging in our hallway, because everybody that comes into the distillery is a Steeler fan, because we're in Washington and Pittsburgh. They want to know why Art Rooney's picture is hanging in our hall. And a couple times I've just said, oh, he was a whiskey fan, but rather than trying to explain to them who Bill Owens was. But
it's why not?
Yeah.
So with Bill helping out like that and I mean, I can't disagree with him. You got to do whiskey where you're at. Even if you had done other things, you got to do whiskey.
Right.
So in the years since you've gotten off the ground and been producing, what does he think about you using peat?
We have not talked to him about that. So yeah.
Purposefully or accidentally?
I think he'd approve.
Okay. Of course, it's worth noting. So you have a peated rye, a peated bourbon as well.
Right.
That both of them I got to try. There are going to be reviews to come out and tasting notes, of course, with this episode. Both definitely worth trying. Oddly enough, I think by themselves, I liked the unpeated rye better. But when the peat was added in, I actually like the peated bourbon better than the peated rye.
Okay.
Which is weird. I thought it was going to be the opposite. So, but still, they're both quite good. And as you point out, there are very few people doing peated American whiskeys. let alone specifically a peated bourbon.
Right. Right.
So, the obvious comparison, I know Alan brought it up on Distillers Talk. First one people are going to compare to is Kings County.
Right.
With the
Right.
peated bourbon. And I love Colin at Kings County. I like their peated bourbon as well. But to your knowledge, are there others also doing peated bourbon that we should take a look at?
More and more. I know that there's a distillery in Detroit called Two James that has a peated bourbon. I've seen at least one or two others, but the names escape me right now. But Two James is the kind of the one that I've seen, and I think they have, Two James has a decent size distribution footprint in the Midwest. So a friend of mine actually brought me a bottle of their peated bourbon from some liquor store in the Midwest outside of Detroit. And we're all different. I've tasted Kings County, and I tasted Two James, and obviously I taste ours. And it's really interesting to see the different kind of flavor profiles that we all have. I mean, they're all very different, but they're all very good.
And the peat coming into or the peat coming into your whiskeys and into the Liberty Pole banner, as it were, was because of your wife.
Correct. Right? Correct. So this goes back to my to my hobby distilling days. And I'm an American whiskey, Irish whiskey. I love Irish whiskey, but I've never been a Scotch lover. And so I was making bourbon and rye, and I was triple distilling things in the style of an Irish whiskey. And one day my wife just said to me, "Why don't you ever make anything that I like?" And she loves the Islay Scotches. So you can only get peated malt as a hobbyist at brewery supply stores, which is where I was getting my malt. But because peated malt is something that less is more in a beer, you can only get it in very small quantities. So I just did the math, and I couldn't justify buying enough quarter-pound bags of peated malt to make 100% peated malt whiskey. So I had also had Derek Bell is the founder of Corsair. He had put out a kind of a really awesome book back then on kind of whiskey recipes and whiskey ideas, and he had in there kind of a peated American whiskey that combined peated malt with other grains. And that's where I got the idea to kind of make that in my home still. And it was delicious, and it was really the trigger that kind of gave me and my wife and family kind of the confidence that maybe we did have something that we could really leverage into a brand and a business. Because I think you need that hook. You need something. There's so many bourbons out there that having that peated bourbon in the portfolio, while it's not our biggest seller and it's very polarizing, it does get you that, oh wow, what's this peated bourbon? It gets people in, and then they'll try the rye or they'll try the bourbon, and they may love the peated bourbon, they may hate it, but it is that novelty that really gets people. And I think that's what craft distilling is all about, right? We have to have that unique product. We have to use heritage grains, or we have to make a peated whiskey, or we have to do something that separates us from the Maker's Mark and the Jim Beams. Those guys make fantastic whiskeys. They make them a lot cheaper than we can make them, but yet they could not pull off a peated bourbon in an experimental batch at the size of their process. They just couldn't do it. And so that's what really, I think, gives craft distillers a little bit of an advantage in the market these days, kind of that nimbleness.
Makers has that 46 program. Maybe I think their last entry was to add the French Mendiant stave. Maybe they should add like, a quarter cast stave from
There you
Lefroy or
go.
something in there.
There you go. Yeah.
They trade barrels all the time. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
Lefroy
And there's a
Lefroy's
lot,
all like maker's mark.
there's some distillers out there that do that finish in Isla casks, and it's a different kind of peated expression, but yeah, there's so many neat things you can do.
Well, so that was my next question was, so Ellen, I should say her name is since she liked the peat, she pushed you to include it, to try it out. Was she more of an Isla style, or what kind of peat profile was she looking for when first brought it up?
So Ellen, to this day, the peated bourbon is her favorite Liberty Pole expression. She still loves peat. Um, Ellen still Ellen still gravitates to the heavier peated Islas. I mean, I just got her an Octomore for Christmas, so she was very pleased at that. So for Ellen, the peatier the better. She really does. There's a group here in Pittsburgh. They call themselves Boggers United, and they have shares once a month, and it is just peat city, and I go with her to those. And a couple of the guys know I'm not a real peat lover, so they'll bring me a bourbon or a rye to sample. But she's all in. The peatier the better.
But the reason I asked too is because let's see, I believe it was also the episode of Distillers Talk. You said the peat profile that you have now is more of a Highland Scottish peat, so not super medicinal, not that maritime-y,
Right.
little lighter.
Right.
So is that kind of the compromise between the two?
I wouldn't even say it was a compromise. I would say it was just, it was what's available. We looked, and, Isla, we could not find Isla peat anywhere on the market. I think most of that peat is harvested and kept on the islands. We were able to get a peated malt from Inverness in the Highlands, and it's basically what was available to us. But it worked out quite well.
No, for sure. It fits well. It matches well with it. And I mean, when you say you're getting heavily peated, you're going to 60 ppms.
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
I mean,
we get the heavily
no
peated, and it's actually about 30% of the mash bill, maybe a little over, about 31% of the mash bill. So so it really makes its presence known. You're drinking a peated whiskey, but it's not 100%. It's not an Isla. It's not a Scotch peat. I mean, it's not a single malt all peat. It is it's 30% heavily peated, 60% corn or rye, depending on whether we're making the peated bourbon or the peated rye. But yeah, definitely it's definitely noticeable.
Yeah, when I actually went back to retaste the products after trying a couple of newer peats that I hadn't had before. So, and one of them, which I think fits very well with this, was from Slieve in Donegal in Ireland. And that kind of peat was, number one, the peat profile was different. It was closer to a Highland than to an Isla, despite it being on the coast. But they also don't do 100%. It's a portion of the blend.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went back and tried that, their Midnight Silky, which is their most peated version, reminded me to go back to Liberty Pole, because the profiles and the proportion of peat in there matched up very well. Now, they're using all barley. It's not multiple grains, but still the idea of it being just a portion of the mash bill rather than the whole thing.
And I think, I know that we've been told that our peated whiskeys have actually been a little bit of a gateway whiskey to people that wanted to try to learn to like peated whiskeys. But because it's, it's just a portion of the blend, or portion of the mash bill, it's a little bit more subtle, but it's let people kind of get used to that profile and move on to full single malts. And we've turned a few people into peat lovers.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great way to get into it. The same way, I mean, I got into it through Highland Park originally. Again, different idea, but the difference in peat and the lighter style of it. Like I still don't get the people who start off with Lefroy and like that's like, oh yeah, I love this stuff right off the bat. I just don't get it.
No.
But to each their own.
Yep.
So with the peat, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything on that one. No, perfect. So you have peated malt, next step in the process. And of course you have the other grains as well. We'll get to those in a second, but next step in the process, fermentation, distillation. Now I'm going to throw the fermentation part for the most part. Definitely listen to, Alan's episode with Distillers Talk, where Jim was the guest. I don't want to duplicate Alan's stuff. He speaks about some things better than I do, so I'll leave that to them. But I did want to jump back to the idea that you had been kind of playing with yeasts. And at one point you were using exclusively American ale yeast, and now using some of Pat Heist's yeast from Firm Solutions. So where are you now with that, and what's the playing around look like?
We've kind of settled in on Firm Solutions. We love that yeast we get from Pat from Firm Solutions. Man, I wish I could remember the yeast, the actual name of the yeast. We've tried a couple of their whiskey yeast, but yeah, we've settled in on Firm Solutions yeast. We just love the flavor that it creates. We love the attenuation. It's just Pat's a smart guy, and Wilderness Trail has taken off. So, there's a lot to be said for, kind of using and they've always said they're using the same yeast at Wilderness Trail that they're selling out of Firm Solutions. So, the one thing that we do like to do is we do for the industry, I think it's a fairly long fermentation. We do a 6-day fermentation. We like those secondary fermentation things that go on, in days 4, 5, and 6. We get those, we get a little bit of lactose creation. There's a lot of wild yeast we have in our distillery. It's just something that, we don't have the corporate overlords, kind of saying, hey, you got to empty that fermenter after 48 hours, 72 hours, and fill it up again. We can kind of control what our production schedule is, and that really gives us the ability to kind of extend those fermentation times out a little bit.
I mean, the 6-day 144-hour fermentation is quite long, especially in U.S. distillation.
Yes,
it was notably long, and like you said, you got the secondary, that malolactic fermentation kicking off. I'm curious though, with the switch from the American ale yeast to Firm Solutions yeast, undoubtedly there's going to be some flavor change there, just by nature of it being slightly different yeast.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm curious what you kind of foresee as the changes to the profile, and how those changes are going to work with, for example, the peat, but just in general.
The changes were for the better. Let me put it that way. We like the flavor profiles that we were getting out of Firm Solutions. We've been using it now for probably 3 years. So we're actually getting finished product out of barrels that was fermented with Firm Solutions. And yeah, it's just with any change we make, David, we evaluate it, and if it's a change that improves the process, improves the flavor profile, is more cost efficient. There's a whole bunch of variables that go into kind of making a change to the process. But yeah, we had a unanimous decision that we really liked the Firm Solutions product.
And again, I know you didn't take it this way, but no means to insinuate that it wouldn't have been a good move to make.
Yeah.
But it's
a big change.
It's a big change.
It's a big change. It's a foundational kind of building block of your whiskey is the yeast. But yeah, we definitely had a little period of using both and comparing and tasting the White Dog and then tasting it at 6 months and a year, and we could sort of determine that it was going in the direction that we wanted it to go with Firm Solutions, and just kind of made the move. And we did the same thing with barrels too, right? That's a very big change too. And we had a longtime barrel supplier, and we started evaluating a secondary one, and kind of filled them side by side for over a year. And any change is scary, but you have to do it in phases and evaluate what's going on as you're moving through the phases.
And we'll, time permitting, I'm sure we'll get to the barrels too, because that's from West Virginia Great Barrel Co.
Correct. Correct.
And we got to talk about that Appalachian oak instead of the Ozarks. So it sounds like I'm rushing through, but there really is so much to talk about with Liberty Pole, and I love that about you guys. Jumping ahead a little bit to the stills, I was fortunate in that you shared with me some of the Harold's barrels, which was fortunately and unfortunately my favorite, I think, of everything that was shared with me. I say unfortunately, listeners, because Harold, the old still, is no longer with Liberty Pole. It does have a second life, but it's no longer with Liberty Pole. So Harold, just fill us in. It was your grandfather's name?
My dad.
Sorry, your dad.
Yep.
Your dad's name. And so your dad's name, and the first thing that came to mind when I heard that was, name is still whatever you want, but it was the first still I can remember that was named for a man. Because usually it's it's almost always a woman or a muse or something like that, like a ship.
Yeah.
So did you have any kind of superstition about, I don't know if we could use a man's name on the still or anything like that?
So the only superstition we ever heard was again, before we started the distillery, doing our due diligence and visiting distilleries. And I wish I could remember who told me this, but some distillery owner somewhere said, "Jim, name your still." He said, "You can name it whatever, but if you ever go to a distillery, the first question you should ask on a tour is, what's your still's name? And if they don't have a name, don't trust them." So we kind of decided early on that we were going to name these stills. And my Ellen's father, my wife's father, was a chemistry teacher, and so our original setup was a 300-gallon production still, pot still, that we named Harold, and that was after my dad. And we kind of thought that my dad worked in the steel industry, and I never saw him drink anything harder than a Catawba Pink on New Year's Eve. But when he passed away, my mom said, "Well, who's going to take all your dad's whiskey?" And here he had a closet full of whiskey. And it turns out it was all vendor gifts. If you ever watched Mad Men, that time in the 60s, whiskey was king, and lots of vendor gifts. So my dad would just bring it home and stick it in a closet. And so we thought, naming the still after Harold would be fitting. The analogy kind of worked, right? The still gives us a lot of whiskey and it never drinks it. But my wife's father, his name was Howard, right? And Howard was a chemistry teacher. And our initial setup had a 30-gallon research still, and we use that to kind of fine tune a lot of the trial whiskeys that we were thinking about making. And hey, what better name for a research still than Howard, who was a chemistry teacher? So you had Harold and Howard. I mean, you think we'd make that up, but those were actually my father and my wife's father's names. So it just fit really perfectly. And Harold retired. He's now at Golden Beaver Distillery in Chico, California, making some really good rice whiskey. So I see his picture on social media all the time, and happy he's still chugging along.
Yeah, Chris Koenig is quite prolific on social media in a good way. If he's listening, yes. I mean that in a good way. And it's good to see that the still has a second life and is still being used.
Yeah.
And so Harold was 300-gallon, and now you've got a 600-gallon.
Correct. And we just call him Big Harold. So
Big
he's
Harold.
Still Harold, but he's Big Harold.
Fair enough. Did that second one also come from Trident Stills? No,
that one came from Specific Mechanical. They're located in Victoria, British Columbia. The story there is that we love Trident, we love Jesse, but my sons who do the distilling, they're mechanical engineers, and they're very regimented. And when we were considering the expansion, the upsize, we started thinking about vapor flow and copper contact, and how much copper contact is there in the whiskey head. And Trident, they would give us a 600-gallon pot, but the head wasn't upsized. It was the same size head that we had in our 300-gallon still. We just felt like, based on the mechanics and the vapor flow of a bigger still, we needed a lot bigger whiskey helmet. So we love the flavor profile that we got out of our 300-gallon still. So we kind of designed the dimensions of what we thought we needed in a 600-gallon still. It's very similar shaped whiskey helmet to what we had on our Trident. We put it out to a few places, and Specific Mechanical said, sure, we can fabricate that for you. So they put together, and it's been awesome. And we really didn't detect any very major noticeable flavor changes from the 300 to the 600-gallon still. And I think a lot of it is due to basically being able to replicate the dimensions of our smaller still in a larger format.
Right. I mean, that makes total sense. You don't want to lose the copper contact that you had gotten. You want to make sure that even on a bigger still, like I think of it as a bigger barrel in many ways. Same. You can put the same liquid in it, but it's not going to have the same surface area contact.
Correct.
So making sure you get all that in there. I mean, it makes sense. Completely makes sense. And I still have yet to have a still maker on here.
Oh, you should.
Like I need to have one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've had a cooperage and a half. I count Greg Snyder as half a cooperage because he ran the cooperages. But I need to get a still maker on here because from their perspective too, you guys were unique. You had a still to work off of, and you also had sons who were mechanical engineers. You could work that out. Not everyone has that, so not everyone can calculate the amount of square footage or square inches within the still and the copper contact that you would need to replicate. So I'd love to hear from the other side too.
Right.
With that being said, let's see. I guess I should ask so just a quick note, why or how did Chris at Golden Beaver end up with Harold?
Yeah, from the ADI for sale by by distillers forum. When we knew we were expanding, we put it on the ADI for sale site, and Chris reached out, and I give him all the credit in the world. He got a friend, he brought his dog, he hooked up a flatbed and drove across country to Washington, Pennsylvania, loaded up, drove back to Chico, California. I think it was the longest kind of 2 weeks of his life, but yeah. I know he made a couple stops. He kind of optimized his trip. He picked up a few other pieces of equipment on the way, but yeah, it was all through the ADI for sale forums.
Good. Shouldn't go to waste. If it's good,
yeah.
If it's good quality, shouldn't go to waste.
Yep.
And now I'm going to have Chris on to see, how does the rice whiskey being made with Harold compare with the grain, I shouldn't say the grain, the barley, wheat, corn, or not rice grain whiskey being made.
Golden Beaver and Liberty Pole are forever friends. And, we manage to trade whiskey a couple times a year. So he's, he's tasting our stuff. We're tasting his stuff. I'm proud to have Harold, working for Chris, and he's putting out great stuff.
Fantastic. So next step of the process, let's go on to those barrels.
Yeah.
So West Virginia, Great Barrel Co. There are a couple of cooperages that are well known in the industry, of course, ISC, Kelvin, some that are a little bit lesser known, like Barrel Mill in Minnesota, Adirondack. For me, at least, I hadn't heard of West Virginia Great Barrel Co. before I guess about 4 or 5 months ago. Oddly enough, not from Liberty Pole, but when Bardstown Bourbon did their collaboration with them,
right.
The Infrared Cherry Oak.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of that product, but the but the difference to me was really apparent in terms of the wood. And so, how did that relationship come about with, you said you kind of considered a couple of cooperages, you'd moved back and forth, or, done 2 or 3 at the same time to test them out. How do you end up with West Virginia Great Barrel? It's a brand new year, the perfect time for a new whiskey experience. This January, my new experience is at Lochleigh Distillery. Sitting on the lowland coast of Scotland, Lochleigh is a relatively new distillery with some iconic names behind it. Set up by Malcolm Rennie, and now overseen by John Campbell, Lochleigh sits on a farm once tilled by the patron saint of everything Scottish himself, Robert Burns. Lochleigh's first release, the Sowing Edition First Crop, was one of my top new whiskies of 2022 and one of the best first releases of the year. At the end of 2022, I picked up the newer Our Barley and Harvest Edition releases in advance of my own interview with John Campbell, and both were worthy follow-ups. Each built on the clean, barley-forward, and mildly lowland style of the Sowing Edition by layering in multiple cask finishes. Each comes in a patterned glass bottle, evoking the barley where all of this starts. Keep an eye out for early 2023. Their Fallow Edition is set to hit shelves in Q1, and I, for one, can't wait. The third in the annual series of limited seasonal bottlings, Lochleigh Fallow Edition First Crop reflects the season of autumn on the farm, when the fields are left fallow to rest after a busy harvest. This will be the first Lochleigh release to be matured solely in 100% first fill Oloroso sherry butts. As always, it is non-chill filtered with no coloring. It comes with a beautiful lavender label to match the rich colors of the previous seasonal bottlings. A big thank you to Impex Beverages for being the Whiskey Ring podcast presenting sponsor, and cheers to you all in a new year. Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. For the holiday season, December, January, we've got even more bottles than usual. available to try and available to buy. If you are a US based listener, there are at least 12 casks just for this month's release, plus additional ones coming out. If you are a UK listener or an EU listener, there are over 30, a ridiculous number of bottles that you can try and get your hands on. Remember to use code WRP at checkout to get 25% off your annual membership.
So they reached out to us, one of their sales guys, very early on when they were just starting up, and their location, where they source their wood, really appealed to us. It is Appalachian oak. They're sourcing wood from West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and kind of Appalachia, as opposed to northern Minnesota, Missouri. Not that there's anything wrong. There's great whiskey made in wood from those areas, but we really like the locality. We like that localness. All right, we want to do as much local as we can. So the fact that a lot of these barrels would contain wood sourced from Pennsylvania really appealed to us. So so we said, yeah, we'll bring you guys on, and we'll kind of evaluate alongside of our current barrel vendor and see how that goes. And we kind of kept giving them more and more allocation, to the point where we were 50-50 with our other barrel supplier. And as the whiskey aged, and we were able to compare barrels from them and the other barrel supplier at a year and a half old, we really liked the direction that the whiskey was headed. And so we switched 100% of our barrels to those guys a few years ago. And they have a really great story in terms of their business and what they've done for the community, which we really liked. There was a really devastating flood in southern West Virginia a couple of years ago. It was in an area near the Greenbrier, which is a very wealthy 5-star resort. And so the flood basically wiped out the town. And so a few of the the members of Greenbrier saw that, and they wanted to bring this town back to life. And they realized that they could build a world-class cooperage, employ a lot of the people that had lost jobs from the flood. And the barrels were in short supply, and there was a great market for them. So they invested in this really state-of-the-art cooperage. They make I think they make industry leading leak rates. I mean, they have a very solid barrel. They do an infrared toasting that you can dial in. You can dial in a toast, to just incredible specificity. We just like them, and they're closer. Their delivery is is a little less costly than shipping from the Midwest. So yeah, they've been a great partner. We're fortunate that we buy enough barrels from them that we've been able to maintain the business. I know barrels have gotten really, really difficult to get, and they've had to cut back on some of their relationships, but we've been able to keep our relationship with them, and hopefully we're going to continue to grow and buy more barrels from them. But yeah, they make a great barrel, and I can't recommend them highly enough.
It's a glowing review for sure, and it's, as you said, it's a heartwarming story that goes along with it. And to your point too, I want to emphasize, Ozark wood, Minnesota wood, even Washington State wood, wherever you get the oak, you can find good oak for these barrels, or another wood if you're being adventurous, but chances are you're going to be using oak. What about the Appalachian? Sorry, which one do you say?
I say Appalachian, but
okay.
I don't know if I'm right.
I think it's very dependent on where you are on that one. So
yeah.
But so what about the let's say the Appalachian oak? versus the Minnesota oak uh, was different for you? Like, did you taste the difference? Did it go towards those leak rates you were talking about?
So, no, I mean, the difference between, the kind of the Kentucky, Missouri, Midwest, ISC Calvin barrels and and the West Virginia barrels was negligible. They all of them produce great whiskey. I think we did notice a little bit of a difference in kind of maybe some Minnesota barrels. It's a colder climate. The rings are a little tighter. I don't think there was the kind of the oak extraction in those northern barrels that we get from a little bit more southern oak. David, we like the localness. We like telling people that we buy our grains from Pennsylvania. We buy our barrels that contain Pennsylvania wood. I hate to say it's a marketing decision because they all make great barrels, but in the end, we did really like the fact that we could tell people that these barrels are made with Appalachian wood.
I think that's completely fair, and I'm thinking too when I was talking with Chris Fredrickson of Traverse City, and he said he doesn't do local just for the sake of being local, but basically, if it presents itself as an opportunity, then of course it makes sense.
Yes,
so absolutely. I mean, I look at Westland too, with they're finding the Gariana oak because they can't harvest it unless it's already fallen.
Right.
Personally, I don't really like the Gariana flavor, but the point remains that it's a local thing that is unique, and to your point earlier, it sets you apart.
Yeah.
So, I got to look more into the kind of if you're getting different oak on the other side of the mountains, if because they're. I was talking recently. I'm thinking of Doc Swinson's, and we were talking about their French oak and their French toasted bourbon. And they use brand new French oak, and we got into a whole discussion about the fineness of the grain, the tightness of the rings, and all of that. So who knows? Maybe it's, as you said, northern oak versus southern oak versus east to west of the mountains. But that's for another day. Those are for other studies to dive into. But these are the nerdiness things that fascinate me the most. So
yeah.
What can I say? So to your point, you're focusing when you can, as much as you can, on the local aspect of what you're doing. And I think nothing right now may be hotter in the local aspect than those rye grains, and which leads into some experimentation with rosin that you got to do.
Right.
And so rosin should be a well-known topic on this podcast by now. I've got a couple of guests who are using it or thinking of using it, talking about it. But for you, recount for us, how did the opportunity to use rosin come about?
So you've got to be familiar with Laura Fields, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Laura and Seed Spark, they kind of spearheaded basically the resurgence of rosin rye. Brought it from several ounces from a seed bank to, over the course of several growing seasons to the point where they had enough to basically run a distillation. And she got that idea from talking to Dick Stoll from Stoll and Wolf. And Mr. Stoll was I guess the last distiller to ever use rosin rye when he was the master distiller of Michter's. And so there was no more fitting person in the world to do the first distillation of this revised or this new crop of rosin rye than Stoll and Wolf. And so they rightfully distilled the first batch of rosin. The next year, for the next harvest, they had grown the harvest a little bit more. And, we were familiar with Laura. Laura knew kind of what we were doing. She liked, how we how we distilled. She felt confident that we wouldn't take this valuable rosin and not do it justice. So she reached out to us in that second distillation season and said, "Would you guys, be interested in taking a shot at rosin rye?" And from her perspective, Stolen Wolf was going to do another batch, but she wanted to see kind of the effect of different mash bills, different distillation styles, right? Stolen Wolf is a column. We are a pure pot still. So she was really interested in seeing kind of how rosin plays across a couple different dimensions. And so we distilled our first batch of rosin rye, I think about 2.5 years now. So, we now have a straight rosin rye. I actually sent Laura a sample about a month or two ago. Haven't heard back from her yet, so I hope that means she doesn't like it. We loved it. It's David. It's fantastic. We then distilled another. So that was that first batch that we did. We only had enough to fill one fermenter, so we only were able to do one barrel. So we have one barrel of 2.5-year-old rosin rye at this point. The next year we had enough to fill all three of our fermenters. So we did a full week's production on that, and we have 5 barrels of a little over a year rosin rye. So that's something that we hope to keep going. I don't know if there's enough rosin rye out there that we can make it our core rye, but to be able to do a couple batches a year is something that we love. We're all about it. We love that. We love the story. We love the flavor profile. So we're excited. We're not sure. It's really good right now. Young rye is actually very good. This 2.5-year-old rosin rye I could put it in a bottle tomorrow and be just very, very proud of what's in that bottle. We're not sure if we're gonna try to hold it to a bottled and bond. We may release it next year as a 3-year-old, knowing that we've got 5 barrels behind it that we can hold off on a barrel or two to get some older age on it. But I will tell you, it is what it's cracked up to be. It's a delicious rye. It's very, the thing that jumps out to me the most is just the nose, the bouquet on it. It is just so floral. It just has this beautiful nose to it.
Yeah, I have to agree. I've honestly not tried your rosin rye yet. I look forward to the day when I can. But I have gotten to try Stolen Wolf, and I also got to try some of the rosin off the still. Fresh 131 proof. Nice nostril cleaner, but it did taste quite different. Still recognizably a rye, but just so uniquely oily and spicy. And similarly, gotten to try Mammoth from Michigan, also different. It's still rosin, but it's still a rye, but it's also different from there. So I really look forward to kind of adding your guys' rosin to the tasting palette to see what it's like. And
we still have some of the White Dog off the still, so maybe I'll throw a little sample bottle your way here before too long, so you can taste a pot distilled White Dog rosin.
That would be fantastic. And so that makes me ask, because of course there's friendly competition between you guys, between you and Stolen Wolf and anyone using rosin, but in some ways, just because of the fact you're using a pot still, it would have been more common style to use in Pennsylvania before the column came around. Is there any kind of discussion, or has there been a discussion about what's a more kind of authentic, if you will, expression of the rosin?
And
that's not to get you in trouble, so you can pass it off if you want.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I think I would say that and Laura will correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I would say that probably the most authentic still that was big with Rosen was probably a 3-chamber still. I think that the use of the pot still kind of predates Rosen. Rosen was introduced a little bit after the colonial period that we tend to honor. That pre-prohibition period in Pennsylvania rye was kind of dominated by 3-chamber stills that Todd Leopold has running in Colorado.
Mm.
But I think a pot still is a little bit more leaning towards a 3-chamber than maybe a column still is.
It sounds like we're gonna need to get some. When we grow a little more Rosen, we're gonna need to get some over to Todd and have him run it through the 3-chamber.
I've heard a podcast with maybe him and Laura that he's very interested in getting it. So I'd love to taste it.
Excellent. All right. So just last couple of minutes, I want to talk about what's the future hold for Liberty Pole.
We're a little bit unique, I think, in that we've been very focused on growing, but growing hyper local. I mean, we're not distributed outside of Pennsylvania. We've not been interested in kind of any sort of external distributor model to other states. Pennsylvania is a big state. There's a lot of opportunity in the state stores in Pennsylvania. Our focus has always been on our kind of our distilling process, which we're kind of proud that we've done everything without using kind of the usual consultants. There's a lot of and these consultants are great that have done a lot of work across the United States helping distillers get started. We've not used any outside consultants. Everything we do has been developed in-house, and we're really proud of that. And we think that our whiskey kind of reflects that we're not using similar processes to other people. And we're really trying to win our backyard. We're really focusing on Western Pennsylvania. We're in the middle of building a kind of a new campus about 4 miles away from our current location. And we're hoping to open in June or July, but we're going to have a really nice facility. We're going to have a barrel warehouse where we're bringing in Bassitt Construction, who does most of the barrel rick house construction in Kentucky. They're going to build ricks for us in our warehouse. We're going to have a warehouse that'll have 5 levels of ricks, 3 barrels per level, 3,600 barrels, which for us capacity, that's a lot. We're going to have a big production facility compared to our current place. We're going to bring over Big Harold. He will be our spirit still. He'll still be our finishing still. We're getting 1,000-gallon pot still from Vendome to be our stripping still. We're going to have a kind of a colonial themed tasting room because we're really big on the experiential nature of what we do. We try to really, our motto is to give people the best whiskey experience possible, and so from the second that people walk into the colonial themed tasting room, I mean, the fit and finish and the attention to detail that we try to put into our tasting room, we do the same thing with our whiskeys. And so our immediate future is, expanding in place, expanding here regionally in Western Pennsylvania, a bigger tasting room that we hope will be an attraction for people that may not have a full weekend to travel, to drive 8 miles to Louisville. They can see a fully integrated distillery in Washington, Pennsylvania. So yeah, eventually, with the increased production in our new place, we do anticipate trying to expand into a couple regional markets. I mean, I never envision us being, in 50 states. I want to get into markets that we can visit and support and help sell, because I know that, that distribution model, the distributors aren't going to sell your product. You have to sell your product. So, so we want to get into markets where, we can help. We can get to New York and Ohio and West Virginia much easier than we get to California and Nevada.
Sure. And I was thinking if and when you expand to New York, you're going to have your kickoff at Francis Tavern downtown. So it might, now that I think about it, now that I say it out loud, it might be a little sacrilegious in a way, but I think it would still work beautifully. Do you know Francis Tavern?
I don't.
So it's the oldest operating bar in New York.
Wow.
It's from 1754, I want to say.
Oh my, it's perfect.
And for a period, it was the headquarters of Washington's army. I think in the very earliest parts of the war, and then also after the war, because mostly Revolutionary War, New York was held by the British. But it was where he finally disbanded the troops, was from Francis Tavern. And they've got these, the whole thing is set up as kind of an eating house and museum, and very close to the water. And you got these long wooden tables. It fits perfectly.
That's absolutely perfect.
So next time you find yourself in New York, I'll bring you down there. They have a great whiskey selection, because of course they do. And we'll share a dram there.
I would love it.
All right. Sounds wonderful. So, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really glad we got to do this, talk about Liberty Pole spirits, about peating American whiskeys, about Harold and Big Harold, and all the different things going on. Look very much forward to trying what you've got now and what you've got coming out in the future. And in the meantime, for the episode show notes, be sure to look for links to the website, to any kind of social media, to where you can buy Liberty Pole spirits, where you can visit them. And I'll update that also, once your new campus opens, I'll update that with some more information. And in the meantime, thanks again for coming on. Thanks to everyone for listening. And it's been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast.
Thank you, David. Pleasure.